have a couple of slides because I was actually hoping to have more of a discussion and Q&A today. But first I want to thank, and I know they had to leave, but I very much appreciated Mark's comments over the years. Yes, thank you. Very helpful as a researcher. Whenever I've been involved, whether it's with the Agent Orange work that I've done with military veterans and other communities, when we hear from community members, it helps us understand the scope of our research and what we look at. We also learn from everyone that has been impacted because it helps us to focus the objectives of what we're looking at. But more importantly, the issue came up of the changes that have been proposed at EPA and the challenges we're having in having these substances tested and the data that we need to do to set regulatory levels. And while the scientists are yelling and writing letters, it really helps us when the community does that because it gives more perspective and more context because you are the ones impacted. So I wanted to thank Mark, and I hope to work with him again in the future. I'm here today just to let you know about the latest news. We were recently notified that the University of Albany, in partnership with the New York State Department of Health, has been funded as one of the sites for the National Multi-Site Study to help communities understand what the potential health effects are related to the PFAS contamination in drinking water. We're one of 7 sites across the country. We were very pleased to receive this funding. I was also very pleased because part of this funding is we had to write and plan to have a very large component involving community engagement, which means in order to do our work, we are required, we would have done this anyway, but the fact that the CDC was saying that they want to see this as part of the proposal and as part of our accomplished work, to work directly with the communities to gather feedback on the communities as we design the study itself, and then to give regular feedback on what we're finding with our observed analyses, and then what the next step should be, and to include the communities throughout that whole process. So I was thrilled with that. So as was mentioned, I'm the PI from the University of Albany. Betsy Lewis-Michael is a toxicologist with the New York State Department of Health, and I believe some of you have already met her. She has helped lead some of the biomonitoring work that is going on in Newburgh, and she will be a collaborator with me on this study. So again, as I mentioned, ATSDR, which is an arm of CDC, is helping to fund this health effect study. And there are 2 components. One is all 7 sites will be asked to administer the same core protocol, meaning we will use similar questionnaires, we will measure similar outcomes so that we can then merge our data together. And that gives us more statistical power to look at a wide variety of health outcomes in both adults and children. So that is a strategy that I've used before in birth defect studies. New York has been involved in a national birth defect study, also funded from CDC, that has a very similar approach. And it is a way for us to look across the country on what the combined effects are. In addition, each site was allowed to propose a series of studies that are unique to New York. So in this case, it would be Newburgh and Hoosick Falls. And we proposed some ideas, and we will, again, working with the community over the next year, also gather feedback and information from you to see what you are interested in. So the other 6 sites that have been funded are in California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And if I remember correctly, let's see, Colorado, Massachusetts, and Michigan are all related to military installations and exposures through that. And then, California, and then Hoosick Falls, as part of one of our sites, are related more to the manufacturing exposure. So as many of you already know, Hoosick Falls primarily has exposure to PFOA as a result of the manufacturing facility in their village, whereas here the majority of the exposures that we're measuring are PFOS and PFHXNS. Okay, and so part of the study, we will be enrolling in New York 1,000 adults and 300 children between the 2 sites. We will hope this first year is planning for the study itself, as well as working with the community and you'll be seeing a lot of me as well as staff and collaborators and our students to plan and organize for this. We will have clinic sites, and we will select sites in consultation with all of you for families to come in who are eligible, and during that process we will draw blood, we will gather urine, we will have a short questionnaire. The children will undergo neurobehavioral assessments using a very similar protocol that I've used in another one of my studies called Upstate Kids, where we administered some of these tests in a cohort of 6,000 children that we've just completed in New York. We will also do some basic types of measures that you're all familiar with from physical, so blood pressure, height and weight, things that we need to measure in order to look at subclinical effects as well as diagnostic effects over time in both the adults and the children. So, and then an important part of this is that everyone will receive a report. You will receive a report of the diagnostic outcomes. You will also receive a report of what we find and measure in the blood test. So the blood test will measure exposure as well as things like thyroid function, kidney function, which is very important as we just heard, as well as immune function, which is another component and a concern related to some of the exposure to the PFAS. Let's see. So we will have this one-time visit and with the screenings, and then have the report at the end. Yeah. So again, this is just we are working with you. We will provide you regular updates. We will have a study-specific website. I actually was notified today that the email we've set up is now approved, so that's simple. That's just going to be pfas@albany.edu, and we'll be able to communicate very regularly. We'll have a Facebook page, emails, and travel to the communities as often as we can to answer questions and work with you throughout the next year. And again, this information over the next 5 years, as we're working with our studies, is to provide the community, most importantly, the community with information, because information is power. Right? So if you have information on what is happening, what we're seeing with the scientific results, but also what you have in terms of your report, in order to be able to communicate with the clinical community as well as with education community if needed, that'll give you the information that you have. And again, we plan to work with the community to help facilitate those communications and those efforts. So there's a lot going on in Newburgh right now from both ATSDR and the health department, so I just kind of wanted to give a little overview. I hope to have, actually we're working on designing some sort of handout that has a map that will, so everyone is familiar with what's going on. So the study I just described is the health study. And so that's the one where we're actually going to look at exposures and health together. In addition, we've had the New York State Department of Health has had the biomonitoring program. The first round of biomonitoring was completed in 2016 and 17. They're starting to gear up for a second round of biomonitoring. So biomonitoring is simply the blood test, and that's to look at what exposure you have in the blood. It's not correlated with any health outcomes. It's just to give a sense of whether or not the exposure levels are decreasing over time. That is so far what they're seeing in Hoosick Falls with the switch out of the contaminated water to water that has been filtered, but they want to continue to monitor that. And also look, it's very important for us to understand what the patterns are. So do exposures vary by length of time on the water system, by gender, by men and women, because sometimes with chemical exposures we see differences by men and women because of our body compositions. Women, like it or not, we have a higher % body fat across the board. That is, it has to do with pregnancy and our ability to bear children, and so sometimes that causes chemicals to have different half-lives in our bodies and to be stored differently. So we have to understand these differences in order to understand the impact on health outcomes. So that's what the biomonitoring program is, and that is through the New York State Department of Health. ATSDR has also selected Newburgh as one of many sites across the country to undergo this extensive exposure assessment program. And these are communities that have been exposed as a result of military-related exposures. And so the ATSDR is just now starting this program in Newburgh. They're gearing up to start reaching out to the community. This will also involve a blood draw as well as gathering information, infrastructure information on the water system in Newburgh and the water history and what they've been able to test over time. And they're planning to do this this spring, early 2020. So if you hear from them, that is what they're looking at. So again, that's a little bit different because they're looking at exposure assessment. They're trying to understand the patterns and the more specific exposure reconstruction history of what's going on in Newburgh. So all of these are very important because they provide information, and what we learn from each of these other components will also help us understand when we go to look at health effects in the children and the adults. But they are distinct and involve different people. So we'll keep reminding everyone of all these just so you know who to contact, and so it's clear. And when we have the website up and running, which should be in a week or two, we'll also make sure there are clear links so that you can identify and contact the people that you need. That's all I had for that because I wanted to open it up for questions. Yeah.
I have a question. I just wanted to ask you, when you say you're going to be sharing information with the clinical community from the study, does that mean our doctors?
Yes, and so so I can't, obviously for confidentiality reasons, I'm not allowed to just out of the blue contact your doctor. I can give you the report to you to give to your doctor, but I can then meet with doctors and provide documentation to the doctors and provide training to the doctors and nurses and clinical community into how to understand the reports and give you information as well in terms of what types of questions to ask. So we'll do a little bit of both.
And I asked that just because it wasn't clear if that language meant, just people's doctors. And are you doing that because there is a lack of information?
Physicians in general don't have a lot of training in public health, but in particular environmental health literacy. And I have a colleague who specializes in the health literacy area and environmental health literacy, so we've been talking to her about ideas of how best to communicate and provide that material that the clinical community will need in order to best know how to respond to as you come in with your reports, but also to arm you with information on what kinds of things you could ask as well. So we anticipate, as we work with you over the next year, to kind of come up with different plans of who you feel might need to have this additional information, additional training. We can do group trainings like, in churches or in office buildings, or we can provide as well as literature and post things to our website. So whatever that feedback. Yeah.
2 points. First of all, what does ATSDR stand for?
Thank you. It's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It is a component of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That is the agency that is supposed to be tasked with providing information, compiling a registry on chemicals and their health effects.
Okay, and the other question I have is this study obviously is going to take a very long time, but can you in the meanwhile function to provide guidelines for limits to be set as was discussed?
So
on what is considered toxic.
Yeah, excellent.
Right.
In other words, how is this going to feed into, and can you feed it into more quickly, limitations on contamination?
Right. So we've actually proposed a number of means to do additional analyses throughout the process so that because you're correct in that the data collection itself will take place in a year, and then we have to analyze the data, and that piece will take time. However, with the biomonitoring results that that the DOH is doing, but also a number of us, I'm working on other studies looking at the exposures to PFOS and PFOA, as well as some of the proposed site-specific analyses that we would like to do in the meantime, while we wait for these other results to be completed. We can provide that into the literature as well as provide information for congressional testimony and keep getting that information out into the public so that we can continue to push for the regulatory level. So all of that, whenever regulation levels are put, all of that is supposed to be used. There's a lot of pushback right now from an EPA and what should be used. But all of that we can continue to put out there. So for example, in the Substate Kids study I mentioned, we received permission from the moms to sample the newborn blood spots. So when babies are born, they all have a heel stick, and 5 drops of blood are taken to test for conditions that need to be identified at the time of birth, and so that the baby can receive treatment immediately. In New York, we're very fortunate because New York saves those 5 blood spots on a card and puts them in a freezer. We were able to receive permission from the moms to test those cards for PFOA and PFOS. And we detected out of the just under 4,000 babies we tested, 99% had measurable levels of PFOA and PFOS and PFOA at the time of delivery. So this is exposure they're getting from what the mom's ingesting during pregnancy. Now, we did not see an association with birth outcomes. However, by the time the children are 7 or 8, we are starting to see a little bit of an effect related to ADHD and behavior, which corresponds to what we're seeing in the animal literature and in some of the epidemiology literature. The epidemiology literature is a little bit mixed. Some show an association, some don't. So that's one of the reasons in this study where we will plan on looking and doing those neurobehavioral assessments in the children so that we can see if we are able to replicate what some of us are seeing in the other cohorts in New York State. Yeah.
Hi. A couple years ago, we had a lot of blood testing here in Newburgh. And I know I took it, and most people in the room took it. And I went to every public hearing. And everybody was very nice from the Department of Health. And then I said, okay, my numbers are this, it says it's a little higher, this says it's at the median, the other's in there. And I said, so what does it mean? And you know what the answer was from the Department of Health?
They don't know.
We don't know, okay? And I went to all the public meetings, and I'm sure, I see a lot of people here that I know, and I'm sure you did also. So, I think what should be done though, is to compare the results that you had a couple of years ago with what people are now. Because people were saying, well, it dissipates over so much time and all that. So all I'm saying is, and I'm not defending it, and I've been very harsh on the Department of Health and wanting to get them to do stuff and to get lower PFAS and PFOS standards. Will there be a comparison?
So, and I'm thrilled you brought that up. So, my colleague Michael Bloom is a professor at the University of Albany with me, and when we wrote the proposal, one of those site-specific analyses we proposed was to, with your permission, and I'll talk about that in a second, to use your stored biomonitoring bloods that you have, as well as the results from the exposure assessment, and compare what you had initially when DOH first took that blood, and to look at the health outcomes that you report in the questionnaire, as well as to look at your newer exposures, to be able to do those comparisons.
You got 3 years.
Absolutely, and that's what we call a prospective study. Yeah, absolutely. It's very valuable information, and that's why I said the biomonitoring is so important. So one of the very first activities we're going to do now, and again, so we don't have to wait, all of you that did participate in the biomonitoring will be receiving a letter with a consent form asking for your permission for us to access that stored blood as well as the results, so that we can start doing some comparative work prospectively on what your measurements were 3 years ago versus what they will be in the new study moving forward. So that's exactly,
My office will follow up.
so excellent. Yeah.
Thank you for giving us advance notice, because I'm gonna have to start looking for that original study now.
So the good news, we should still have a copy of that, but this is, and when we have the website up, we also plan to have all this information up there so that as people have questions, we can do that, so.
One last question here.
Oh, yes, there is, so we don't call it a reimbursement though for ethical reasons. It's a small thank you, appreciation gift for those who do participate. And I believe how it's set up, it's a total, if you participate in all of both the biological monitoring, so the blood draw, as well as the questionnaire and the additional testing that I described in the neurobehavioral, it's $75 per person. So that to really thank you, but also to acknowledge the time, because it'll be about a 2-hour visit. My hope is, but again, we'll be communicating with you a lot during the year to figure out what mechanism might work best for that clinic visit. I suspect one of the models we've done in the past is we will have a clinic site open on particular days, and we'll vary those days, acknowledging people's work schedules and having appointments that people can come to. Yeah.
Will you offer childcare?
So I've done that on my previous study, because obviously children in my study also had siblings, and we did have that as a possibility, so we can definitely talk about that. And the other piece I've added, we actually will be working with a group called Research Triangle Institute. They will be coordinating the actual clinic visit and the actual clinic measurements at that time, but you will see me and my staff here quite a bit. And part of that process, I've asked them to hire local people to do, especially some of our public health students and nursing students at the community college. So, but others who live in the area, so that they can be, because obviously they're most knowledgeable and know the community, and to help do the data collection. And so we can do something very similar for childcare.